Hello, everyone. My name is Jill Marriage. I am a graduate student in Museum and Curatorial Studies at Cal State Long Beach and the lead organizer of Forms of Reparations, Museum and Restorative Justice. This is a virtual symposium that aims to identify the ways in which cultural institutions sustain white supremacy, imperialism, and exploitation. First, Jacob Shoto, a CSULB BFA student in 3D Arts and Woodworking, will give an acknowledgement.
CSULB is located on the sacred site of Puvungna. We acknowledge that we are on the land of the Tongva Gabrieleño and the Ahachiman nations, who have lived and continue to live here. We recognize the Tongva Ahachiman nations and their spiritual connection as the first stewards and the traditional caretakers of this land. We thank them.
Thank you, Jacob. This event as a whole was originally conceptualized by the School of Art Students of Color and Allies in 2018 and then passed to us, making it a truly collective effort within the School of Art. I would like to acknowledge our advisors, Nizan and Julian Myers-Szupinska, as well as our funding sources. That's the California State University Long Beach School of Art, the Instructionally Related Activities Grant Allocation, Associated Students Incorporated, and the Beall Center for Art and Technology at the University of California, Irvine. Within this virtual format, we ask that attendees submit their questions through the Q&A functions on both the Zoom webinar and the YouTube live stream platforms. These are both being monitored in real time, and your questions will be asked on your behalf during the Q&A portion of the session. Please note, if a question is intended for a specific panelist, make a note of that so we can address it properly. All presentations are also being recorded so they can be viewed later on. I'm
Autry. As a cultural organizer in the visual arts, Tanya Autry centers Black liberation and decolonization in her work. In addition to co-creating the Art of Black Dissent, an interactive program that both promotes public discussion about the Black liberation struggle and engenders fighting anti-Blackness through the collective imagining of public art interventions, she co-produced Museums Are Not Neutral, an initiative that exposes the fallacies of the neutrality claim and calls for an equity-based transformation of museums and social justice and museums resource list, a crowdsourced bibliography. Tanya has curated exhibitions and organized programs at MoCA Cleveland, Yale University Art Gallery, ArtSpace New Haven, and other institutions. Through her graduate studies at the University of Delaware, where she's completing her PhD in art history, expertise in the art of the United States, photography, and museums. Her dissertation, The Crossroads of Commemoration, Lynching Landscapes Environment, concentrates on the interplay of race, representation, memory, and public space. Also with us today is Laura Raicovich. Laura Raicovich is an independent curator, writer, and currently the interim director of the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art. Raicovich's work focuses on socially engaged art practices and the civic role of museums. In early 2018, she left her position as the president and executive director of the Queens Museum in New York, following a number of disagreements with board members about the need for the museum to take clear positions on matters impacting the communities it serves. She has lectured internationally on a broad array of subjects and held positions at the global initiatives at Creative Time, the Dia Art Foundation, Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, Public Art Fund, and New York City's Department of Parks and Recreation. At this time, Raicovich is writing a book about museums, cultural institutions, and the myth of neutrality, forthcoming with Verso. And last but not least is Helen Molesworth. Helen Molesworth is a writer and a curator. Her major exhibitions include One Day at a Time, Manny Farber and Termite Art, Leap Before You Look, Black Mountain College 1933 to 1957, Dance Draw, This Will Have Been, Art, Love, and Politics in the 1980s, Part Objects, Part Sculpture, and Work Ethic. She's organized monographic exhibition of Moira Davey, Noah Davis, Louise Lawler, Steve Locke, Anna Maria Maiolino, Josiah McLeany, Carrie James Marshall, Kathy Opie, Amy Silman, and Luke Timmons. She's the author of numerous catalog essays, and her writing has appeared in Art Forum Arts as the curator in residence for the Anderson Ranch in Aspen. She recently hosted a podcast series called Recording Artists with a Getty, and is currently at work on a book about art, love, and freedom. So thank you all for being with us today. And I will begin with the first question. Maybe everyone, we should all unmute ourselves. And our first question to the panel is, all of you are here because you have upset past conventions in and around museums. How have you seen contemporary art museums support notions of white supremacy, and how do you personally navigate the system's resistance to change? Maybe around 5 minutes each for an answer. Who wants to jump in?
Well, that's kind of hard because the question is, wait, how have you seen contemporary art museums support notions of white supremacy, and how do you personally now? So I would just say, one, it's not a notion of, first of all, right? It's not notions, it's not ideas of white supremacy. White supremacy is like real, and it is material and has like effects on our life. It's not an idea so much as it's a real practice, and the entire museum construct is about white supremacy. So contemporary art museums just are white supremacy to me. That's just what they are. It permeates the entire institution. I used to think about it, like I used to describe it as being the blood of museums. And then later in the last year or so, I've actually switched to start talking about it more as the DNA of museums. So it's in the everything. It's in the collections that are up there, or the exhibitions, it's the programming, it's the hiring, it's the language that is used. It's pretty much all of it. I don't know if other people want to challenge that or add to that, but then there's the other part about like how one navigates it. But it's the air, it's the DNA of contemporary art museums. And here I'm specifically talking about these so-called institutions that call themselves mainstream, which I just call white museums because that's what they really are. So I'm particularly talking about those, but white supremacy also permeates other types of institutions as well, because it's a really complicated, multi-layered thing, practice, action, structural problem.
To say that it's interesting, you know, Nizan mentioned my book, which is actually has a title now, which I can share with you. It's called Art Strike, Art in Museums in an Age of Protest. And it'll be out next spring. And part of what my book addresses is exactly what Tanya is talking about here, which is kind of the historical roots of museums and why they came to be in the way that they are. It's not, you know, the book attempts to kind of analyze not only current situations and the ways in which, you know, that white supremacy is enacted and real within these spaces, but also the way that it kind of, the way that it's historically been built in, right? So, you know, just to give a really concrete example, you know, the museum in the United States evolved out of settler colonialism and out of the arrival of Europeans to a land that was already lived on, and you know, there was an active self-governance happening, and you know, it was, you know, conquered. It was seen as open and for the taking, and I institutions that grew out of those attitudes had that way of thinking embedded in them, including, you know, our museums. And one of the interesting things about the evolution of the American Museum is that it took bits of the European piece, but it added its own kind of flavors to that, especially around notions of education. And I think that that's where we get particularly tied up, because I think that there's been this really kind of outward facing knowledge sharing that museums have engaged with over the decades, and beyond pieces of the puzzle where, you know, actual human remains are counted as parts of collections in museums, and other, you know, works that have been looted from other countries, you know, actual objects that portray colonial power. In addition to that, all of the kind of operations of the museum kind of are built out of this mental space. And so, you know, does that mean like, you know, you can't do good stuff inside a museum? I don't know. I am a believer in the structure. I mean, it's sort of a funny thing to say after saying that, like, that I'm still a believer in the structure of the museum, because I think that, you know, that art and the production of art brings meaning into, creates a space for the imagination, and we really need that right now. We need to imagine our ways out of the kind of corners that society has pushed us into. And, you know, and so that's why I have hope for the museum, in part because I think that the more that we make visible, and like Latanya's t-shirt reads, "Museums are not neutral," the more that we make visible the non-neutrality of these spaces and claim their histories, like make them part of the story, rather than it being this kind of backdrop that's not really discussed and kind of slightly denied or shied away from. The more we talk about that, the more that we can really grapple with it. And maybe, just maybe, is my kind of, you know, glass half full kind of gal thinking, that, you know, doing this work inside the museum, because museums are kind of a microcosm in the way that they enact their biases to the larger society, there's a way that we can test things out in this space. And I don't know what you all think about that, but you know, that's something that I'm committed to at least trying.
Hi, everybody. And thank you guys for inviting me, Jill, for arranging this, and everyone who's on the Zoom that we can't see. This is such that weird Zoom moment, but hey. I'd like to, I mean, yes, I absolutely agree that contemporary art museums are, you know, the DNA of them is white supremacy. I'm not sure we could talk about any public institution right now in this country without talking about its structural dependency, adherence, and enactment of white supremacy. I guess what I'd like to do is just try to attend a little bit to the specificity of the creation of contemporary art museums in America, right? Because they did emerge as out of a break, out of a felt and needed break with encyclopedic institutions that, as Laura has so rightly said, had a lot bound up not only in settler colonialism and European models of a museum, but also they put a kind of unique American spin on it, which was very missionary in its zeal around educating a general populace, and often educating that general populace in very explicitly capitalist formations to have better taste so that they could become better consumers, right? I mean, there's a long history in this country of interaction between department stores and museums, for instance. And in the beginning decades of the 20th century, there's a need for a break. There's an idea that contemporary artists, and it largely comes through the inability of general museums to show cubism, right, in real time. So an inability of museums to recognize the profundity of the attack on the picture plane that was cubism, and to incorporate, quote unquote, living artists as part of the fabric of the display, interpretation, and collection of culture. And many of those contemporary art museums were actually called institutes because they were trying, in the way that Laura kind of opens up that little space of hope at the end of what she was saying, because they were trying to imagine, could they be a laboratory? Like, they were even borrowing that kind of language from the sciences. Like, could they be a place where experimentation happened and occurred. And I think one of the things we saw in that is that there were profound failings in those spaces of experimentation, as they did a few things, as they did not examine whiteness, which I'm not sure would have been available to many people forming these institutions in the 30s. They didn't examine patriarchy, and they also didn't examine power structures and where the artist would sit within the conventional power structure of the museum. And so I think part of the reason contemporary art museums, on the one hand, imagine themselves to be free of white supremacy, right, are completely imbricated in it, is because of this, you know, sort of vexed early formation of what exactly it was to be a museum of contemporary art and what it meant or didn't mean to foreground or center or not foreground or center the artist as one of the primary interlocutors in this event structure. So, but that all being said, I want to kind of hold on to those histories because I think they are important to, if one of the tasks ahead is to imagine the world anew, sometimes the past offers paths not taken, right? And so I don't want to leave behind the breadcrumbs of some of the DNA of this break that did happen between contemporary institutions and so-called encyclopedic institutions.
Okay, I'm gonna keep that thread in mind, because I think, you know, the other aspect of it is, of course, that these institutions were born out of the passion of private collectors. The break to a contemporary art museum. But let's move on to the next question, and let's not have the moderator turn into a panelist. And let me ask you about mistakes. Most of us here are often advocating for artists and publics with whom we don't necessarily share the same racial background, education, or socioeconomic status. And even if we do, we can't assume any type of homogeneity. So how have you handled mistakes in real time? And how have the lessons you've learned in hindsight informed your next steps?
I have a lot to say about mistakes. Am I on mute? Okay, no. I think that, you know, in our kind of late capitalist, individualistic world, you know, we put so much purchase on success and innovation, and these words that I think have ceased to have real meaning. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, I think is really important right now, especially as we kind of come to terms with some of the very intense realities of, like, what does it mean to be living during the time of a pandemic? And what does that mean about our relationship and our responsibility to one another as human beings? You know, that to me is like a pretty fundamental question about, like, what does it mean to live in the world? And one of the things it means to live in the world is to make mistakes. And for those to be moments of a potential harm to somebody else, but also of potential growth for the person making the mistake, for, you know, the conversations that can come out of those mistakes. And I think that I think part of the problem of mistakes, when you're talking about, like, institutional mistakes, is that they often happen in a kind of cone of silence and without any transparency or communication around what the different facets of the question might be, or even any clue that an institution is comprised of very many individuals and isn't necessarily speaking in a singular voice. And so, you know, I think, you know, that from an institutional perspective, perhaps slowing down, taking time to really talk more publicly about the questions at hand, admitting to making mistakes, admitting to that, not only that possibility, but that it's gonna happen. And also like the power, and I don't want to overplay the power of the apology, but I do think apologies are really important. Like, not like I'm sorry you feel that way, but like I'm sorry that I hurt you. You know, and I'm so like a more profound method, you know, practice of apology that goes beyond that moment, but shows itself bearing out in actions to follow. And so anyway, I'm talking about like less PR, more kind of engagement. And I just, to me, this is a really important aspect of now, because I hear so many colleagues in the field talking about how they're afraid of saying anything or doing anything for fear of getting taken down or whatever. And I'm like, okay, how about we just talk more publicly? How about we have these conversations with a little bit more generosity towards one another, perhaps, but also like with willingness to accept accountability too.
Yeah, Laura, you pointed out so many important things there. I mean, mistakes are just kind of part of the work if you actually are trying to do, if you're actually committed to changing this society and changing our institutions. And hello, I know I jumped into that first question. I was like, boom. But hello, everybody. And yeah, mistakes are kind of, they are a given if you are just doing the work. But there's a problem in that, like this summer, seeing all these so-called solidarity statements, right? And they were pretty much a performance of care. They weren't about actually caring for like Black and brown folks, Black and brown community members, but it was a performance that so many white institutions decided to do. And even went ahead and like appropriated images of Black artists and Black people. I mean, somebody took my images and slapped it on their website, and without asking me, you know, and my face was just appearing on people's social media. And I couldn't even bother with responding to it, because at the same time I was dealing with so many other forms of racial abuse that were happening in my life. And then to see some institutions, not many, but some put out, you know, a statement, I guess it was supposed to be apology, but a lot of them didn't even really use the word apology. And it felt, you know, again, like a performance, like a not, because it's a lack of authenticity, it's a lack of genuine trying to understand someone else's perspective, and really understanding one's own participation in social violence, one's own participation in white supremacy, one's own participation in colonialism and sexism and elitism. And so instead it's like that thing of, oh, I'm sorry you felt that way, without maybe saying that. But that's what a lot of things that happened this summer. And so it's a disingenuous kind of thing, and it's a lack of having a relationship. And so that's why the mistakes, they're not just mistakes, they really feel like assaults, because there is a lack of actually really caring about anybody else and really interrogating one's own actions, this history of these institutions, the power dynamics that are in place. And so the people who are doing these things, perpetuating these things, you know, they can't actually be, they're refusing to be in relationship with anybody. And so it's a weird thing. Like, mistakes are necessary for real change, and people just make mistakes because we're human, but also some people have a real track record of constant abuse. And so the spectrum is really pretty broad, what's happening. And often when, you know, and I think, you know, this is one of those questions too. I always like to question a question, like these phrases, like most of us. And, you know, the us is something we have to talk about, like who is the us, and, you know, what's our relationship to one another? What's our relationship to communities? What's our relationship, like how our curatorial practice lays out? Those are things to really think about very carefully. And I think each of us as individuals has to do that work on an ongoing, you know, in an ongoing way, because it changes. And I think the other part of this question I thought was interesting is we can't assume any type of homogeneity. And yeah, that's like all those parts. I feel like that, like we should have a conversation on just what that means. But I don't want to hog up all the time. So Helen, you go ahead.
Oh, trust me, if we're going to talk about mistakes, you can hog the time. I'm good. I think mistakes are really you know, I guess I'm going to come at it maybe a little more personally. I think, you know, one of the things that mistakes imply is that there is success, right? And mistake is I don't know, I'm not smart enough to parse the difference maybe between mistake and failure, but for a while, early 90s, there were, you know, there were a lot of us, myself included, who really romanticized failure, right? Because failure seemed to be precisely the thing that could mitigate this extraordinary pressure for success. And the metrics of success in the museum and cultural space were metrics that were being imported by for-profit thinking into not-for-profit spaces. And so failure became a way to kind of protect yourself from a series of measurements that none of us at that moment had been prepared to encounter. In fact, most of us who were in not-for-profit spaces had precisely opted out of those versions of quote unquote success, right? Like we didn't want that. We wanted other things. And so failure was a way of talking about that. And now I realize we don't talk about failure as much. We talk about mistakes, and mistakes feels very personal. Like, you know, like it feels very, or the way they're being discussed now, they're very attached to individuals. And even when they're attached to institutions, they're attached to specific players within those institutions in very barbed ways. And so I've been trying to think about.
Helen, can I interrupt you for a second there? Because I think that you're making a really important point, and it's something that I've seen over and over again. The kind of over-personalization, in a sense, of the mistake within an institution, and where sometimes what happens, and this is, I've seen it in so many different contexts that it's like clear to me that it's, you know, and I think maybe it has to do with the kind of homages or kind of centrality of the director of museums and things like that, and the ways in which that position is highly toxic in many ways. And I feel like there's this thing that often happens where the director who's leading an institution that then gets criticized kind of overly kind of internalizes that as a critique of their own human mistake, when the people who are making the kind of protest or the objection are actually talking about far larger systemic questions and issues that have very little to do with who that human is in the world, and much more to do with how the institution operates as institutions do. And so like I like this distinction that you're making, because I think it's a really important one when we're talking particularly around kind of protest or objections to mistakes that are made or failures. And I don't know that I am ready to kind of parse the different meanings of those either. And I remember that moment in the 90s, and so like that's why I'm in the art world. So, you know, I just like, I think that's really interesting, this kind of. And I remember a moment when I worked at Creative Time, when there was it was like my first 6 months there. It was 2011 maybe, and we did my first Creative Time Summit there, and there was a BDS protest, a boycott, divestment, and sanctions protest, and of the event because of a. Well, it doesn't really matter why, because that's ultimately not the point. The point is that, you know, I saw this as a systemic thing, and some of my colleagues didn't. They felt very personally attacked by this, and it sort of prevented a learning, an absorbing of what this question was. That it wasn't about like, oh, I'm a bad person because I didn't know about this thing, and I got over, you know, whatever. I was like, I don't know about BDS. I need to learn, you know, I need to understand, like I cross this. So how do I do that? And it wasn't about blaming myself necessarily, but I found that others of my colleagues felt very attacked.
Well, I think I do think, I'm glad that distinction resonates with you a little bit. You know, the distinction between like an individual mistake and an institutional, you know, sort of problem or inability to behave in a way that it's being asked to behave by its public, right? Which is how I understand a lot of the protests that and calls for change and action that are happening now. And I also think that in terms of thinking about mistakes at an institutional level, and I realize this could come off as special pleading, and maybe it is, I don't know, you know, but I do want to say, like, I also think that one of the things that has happened over the past 2 decades is these jobs, these positions, the structural position of like director or chief curator or chief operating officer now in museums, these are now essentially unfulfillable job descriptions. Do you know what I mean? Like there's simply failure and mistakes is all you could possibly hope for reading any of these job descriptions. There's no one human being who comes trained to do all of this plethora of things and, you know, be like a good person, an empathetic person, and maybe know, you know, like a little art history and some cultural history and some American history. I mean, like, it's baked in now in this, you know, this culture of expansion for its own sake, right? As the jobs have gotten bigger and the purviews have gotten bigger and the salaries have gotten bigger, all of this is just a recipe for failure and mistakes. So when the question asks, you know, how do you deal with them in real time? It seems like one of the problems of mistakes in real time right now is that they are extremely magnified because the requirement of the job and the actuality of any human being trying to fulfill that requirement are so far apart that you could have nothing but mistakes in real time. And so I don't know how we talk about that in relationship to also moments of self-awareness, self-realization, and self-atonement, which, you know, I'll be honest, a Zoom where you can't see people is a very, you know, like, this is probably not the forum for that kind of conversation, right? So like, you know, it's just, I'll stop.
Yeah, I think this impossibility of the position is really important because I actually think that museum director roles in a kind of, I mean, we have to talk about the failures in a bad way of the nonprofit museum model. And I think that's what you're getting at here, Helen, is that, you know, the impossibility of these positions. And I have been really thinking, like, if I was going to be a museum director again in a more permanent way, I would want it to be a collaborative position, and not in a sense that, like, oh, maybe it's, you know, Helen, Tanya, and me are co-directors, and like Helen takes care of curatorial and, you know, I do the whatever, you know, like not a division of labors in that sense, like by category, but rather a true collaboration on all those fronts, because the reality is that we can't attend to all of the things all of the time. And that's just not an okay demand to make.
Right.
Yeah, I like that where you're going with that, because it's getting more towards maybe a lateral form of organization, right? Instead of what we see typically in museums, a very pyramidal kind of structure, right? With the top, the ED, and then the layers down. I wanted to also address this question from the perspective of, you know, someone who's more on the ground, trying to push for change in a much lower ranking position. And I think I've always felt like a strong sense of urgency, because the problems are immense. People like me do not have positions of power in most of these institutions, right? And again, I'm focusing mostly on these so-called mainstream museums. And we can even be in majority Black cities like where I am here in Cleveland, and there are hardly any Black people in any positions of power. here. So we basically are in an apartheid situation. And so I feel, and that's been going on forever. That's not a new thing, right? It's been going on forever. And yet every now and then they'll be like, oh my God, what do we do? There's been people talking about these things for a long time as well, forever, and writing really important treatises and doing conferences and so forth. And so having learned the history, I felt like this is ridiculous. Like this has already happened, all of these things. Artists have been talking about it. Plenty of other cultural producers have talked about it. So I kind of saw it as like, I want to be pushing for deep, real structural change right now, not being told, wait till later, wait till you rise up in the ranks. And if you get a top level job, then maybe, then you can do all these things. Because I have seen a few Black people who make it up in the ranks, a few people of color, and often they are still not really pushing for a deep change because they can't. Most of them know that they can't because they are basically tokens. We have like a representational kind of politics in place in these institutions in many ways. So I feel a real strong sense of urgency of trying to think of other ways to unite with staff and working with publics and really encouraging more people. That's why we started the Museums Are Not Neutral initiative, is to really try to have as an educational tool to teach more people too about museums and get them to start feeling like a sense of ownership and relation to these institutions. A lot of people don't. A lot of people just stay away from them anyway because they figure they're just violent places. They're not about us. Why should we bother with them? And I'm like, they are violent places and they're not about us. But what if we actually start demanding that they change and be different? My problem has been knowing how to do that. I've not been trained to do that kind of thing. My training is as an art historian, and it's not been a training of teaching us to make changes, make waves in institutions. It's been a training of falling in line with whatever the existing structure is. And then, praying that one day you can do something. And it's like, just, yeah, no. But part of that is that sense of urgency. I have sometimes fallen for when people are using words of social justice. That's a huge thing. That's why I want to make sure to get to this. There are so many people out here that have learned some words, and they're not people who are committed to this work. They haven't been doing it for that long, or just even if cared about it for real at all. And now, partly because of funding, how it's been drying up with private funders, right? So more institutions seem like they're like using these words of social justice, using words diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, and sprinkling them all over documents and so forth. And it's like, again, that performance of change, but it's not actually internalized in terms of their practices and their policies. And sometimes I admit it, I've fallen for that kind of trash when it's been out there because the language sounded right to me and the person seemed like they knew enough, right? But then after I was there for a while, I realized, oh yeah, they're not about this. They're not about this at all. And they're actually like really opposed to it. So if one is in there trying to do anti-racism work, the same people are doing really racist things and trying to silence people like me and other people like me who are really trying to do the work. And so I have fallen for that and then have to pull back. So it's one of these things of trying to figure out, knowing that social justice is trendy. It's great to see more organizations putting money into, like Ford Foundation is putting a lot of money into social justice work, even more than they already were. Excellent. And yet also that makes more pretenders come out and more people will just start appropriating that language that probably just don't know it, or some people might want to know it, but they're really not committing themselves to the political education and really understanding that social justice is about a redistribution of power. It's not about doing the same thing and bringing in a couple of tokens and then push them in the corner and try to make them shut up all the time. And then another thing I learned is that the inclusion paradigm, how problematic that is that there are so many artists of color that, because of the system, this power dynamic that's already in place, they want to keep their position in it. If they've been able to rise up in some way, the few that get in there and get their work, shown or whatever, get paid a little bit, even though it's still totally, an inequitable system. But some people are kind of happy to play the token role. So that's a thing that I have been learning too, is that there will be people who will be like, don't push for too much change because it's working for me. Like, just, again, be quiet, because as long as a few of us get in there and get something, that's better than none of us getting anything, instead of really fighting for a collective liberation, right? And fighting for more, like thinking more along these lines, like you were talking about, a more lateral type of organizing happening, a structure for the institution that could be a more lateral kind of organizing for change as well. But it's really tricky out here. It's really, as my friend calls it, these museum streets. My friend, Dr. Kelly Morgan, she talks about how museums, it's, you know, like we were saying, it's very imbricated. It's a highly textured environment. It's hard to know who to trust. There's a lot of retaliatory behavior. There are people who blacklist folks, and, you know, it's just, it's a scary, it's a very scary thing. As much as it seems so like calm, and, you know, people say, oh, it's really beautiful, you work in a museum, all you must do is sit at a desk and read books and just look at pretty pictures. And I'm like, actually, no, I wish I could just read.
That's what you do, right? That's what you do when you work at a museum, right, Helen?
I have a terrible story. I was once on, when I was still employed in a museum, I was on the table at a masseuse, and the woman said to me, as she, like, I don't know, had her leg, her whole body weight basically leaning on this very painful knot in my back. And she said, what do you do for a living? And I was like, oh, I can't. How can I possibly say now? I work at a museum. That knot is from working at a museum. I mean, she said it like, I'm sure she thought I was going to say I worked in like an ER in a public hospital, you know, like, so yeah.
But yeah, and I think, Latanya, what you were saying about kind of the complexities of the interior kind of negotiations with museums is so it's so relevant and important. And, you know, it's interesting being kind of a interloper right now temporarily with the Leslie Lohman Museum. Kind of, I mean, I got to know my staff via Zoom, if you can believe that. I've only met certain of them, like a handful of people IRL, and I'm like, oh my God, you have legs. Like, that's amazing. Like, legs exist. That's cool. And you know, there was definitely, I mean, I got headaches the first couple of months, just trying to kind of read the room and figure out like what was going on. You know, what are the kind of conversations that need to be happening? And I think, you know, one of the spaces that I feel like, speaking of mistakes, like I felt like I needed to go a little bit more slowly was kind of in the wake of the protests that began with George Floyd's murder. You know, I think I was very like, because I had been thinking for my book about all the ways that I wanted to kind of undo and redo in museums, I was like, okay, this is the go moment, you know, and, you know, people are ready, like, you know, and it wasn't really, and I had to really slow down, and I had to kind of take a step back and take the temperature of my team and really understand kind of where they were all at, and I'm there because I recognize that while, you know, and this is something that was true at the Queen's Museum and is true in any place I've ever worked, that, you know, people's political vocabularies and engagements vary wildly within museums. And so there are folks who, you know, are very facile with this kind of, you know, the kind of activist language. Some people know it as a sort of shortcut. Some people know it because they practice it. And to your point, you know, some people, you know, use it to kind of to tokenize the circumstances. So anyway, I think for me, that was like a moment of kind of taking a step back and, you know, just thinking about, okay, you know, whatever the kind of identity expressions of everyone in this group of people is, you know, we've got work to do together as a group to figure out who we each are and how we're gonna work together. So yeah. Did we lose our panelists?
Yeah, we lost two panelists for some reason. There's a blank screen where Latanya used to be. So you froze at a certain point, but we kept hearing you.
Oh, good.
And now, yeah, and now I can't see Latanya or Helen. We just maybe wait for them to come back on. And I'm just going to mention, because Latanya had in some ways already answered the next question that I was about to ask, because our symposium was criticized for using the term decolonizing, not in its original, let me see how we formulate, but in many ways, Latanya had already started addressing this question of, you use a vocabulary and then the use of the vocabulary covers up the fact that you're not actually doing the real work underneath. So that was something that you already started to address. And we were going to ask, calls for decolonizing museums have been amplified in recent years. And, we pulled that term from this kind of revamping of the use decolonization, but we were criticizing for appropriating it from its original use by Native American scholars. And, so do you think that the term has been appropriated for museums, and will it be subsumed in the same way that diversification has been? And maybe I'll just add to it, maybe talk a little bit more concretely, less abstractly, about what can we really do, because these conditions that you're describing, for example, these extreme hierarchies that are precisely meant to separate workers from the top brass that then can identify with the wealthy donors. So there's a fragmentation because of hierarchy within museums. How can we actually do the work?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to speak to that a little bit. I was hearing a couple of years ago people start using the expression decolonizing museums. I actually was personally staying away from using those words, the decolonization word, the D word there. One, because I knew at the time I didn't know the scholarship. And I realized that as much as I was studying all these other things in museums, I wasn't really reading about.
Uh-oh. Latanya, if you can hear us, you're frozen.
Okay, we're having the Zoom drama.
Well, why don't I pick up where Latanya left off, and then when she gets back in, she can take it back. I've been thinking about this a lot in a number of different contexts, particularly in the research for my book. And there are two particular texts that I think are really important to this conversation. And one is Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, that you can download from the web. And I just think that is a great text that just should be read specifically on this topic of how the word decolonization has been appropriated outside of its original kind of intent that specifically has to do with indigeneity and land use. And then there's another book that I found really useful. It's called Decolonizing Museums by Amy Lonetree. The subtitle on that is Representing Native America in National and Tribal Museums. And that book, I think, just gives a really specific framework around what this word means, particularly around Native American art objects and also cultural objects in national and tribal museum kind of necessarily kind of specifically answer your question, which I think, oh, there's Latanya, she's back. Latanya, I was just saying that there were a couple of books that a couple of resources to speak to your point about like getting to know what the analysis is. And one of them being Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, the Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang text, and Amy Lonetree's book on decolonizing museums. But why don't you go ahead and finish what you were saying?
Yeah, I was going to say that so I started to finally go, okay, no, I'm going to start reading actually about what decolonization is. And yes, it was eye-opening to read it, especially from like Native scholars' perspective. And also another person to think about a lot about decolonization is Frantz Fanon, his book, Wretched of the Earth. He talks specifically about decolonization in there. So, and, you know, the perspectives of, like in the Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang article, they talk about decolonization is really about land, about returning land. And it's really about unsettling. It's not, and they make a very good point. And I think we could also actually branch that out to cultural property, because of course there's a lot of Native people's property that is in these institutions, and a lot of times it's not even property, it's actually people's ancestors. They consider it, you know, the spirits and their ancestors are not objects, they are there. And so I think thinking about cultural property is important as well. And thinking with like Frantz Fanon, when he talks about decolonization, he says decolonization is, I can't remember the exact phrase, but like he says something like total disorder. And so when I have seen museums using the expression, like, and really from the institution saying that it's decolonizing something, I'm typically very skeptical, because I'm like, really? Are you really decolonized? Because I would love to see that. I would love to see a museum really take on that work and to do it. That would be fantastic. And that place, that's a place I think I would want to be a member. Most of the time, I'm not interested in being a member at most museums, but I've seen places say that. And then when I've looked to see what they were doing, it's very low level kind of things. Like it's a wall label. It's a wall label that's probably still got a preferred narrative. You know, it's not going very deep in terms of anything really. And they're not returning objects. They're not like, you know, thinking about interest, paying interest to Native people for the lands that they're on, for these stolen objects, things like that. So it's a very superficial engagement. The work of, and sometimes it's also, I guess, a more deeper one is like Native communities and to kind of be in consultation with objects. That's a little bit more involved. And I've seen a couple of places doing things like that. And some of those, you know, I don't know personally what's going on in those instances, so I don't want to really comment on those things that I've heard of, but I would still question them in a way, because the people that still, in general, look, what I've seen that seem to be in power are the same people who were in power before of those objects and of those institutions. So it's not really, definitely, it's not any Frantz Fanon thing about total disorder, and it's usually not about returning objects. It's still this kind of sense of a white institution feeling in control, but being able to choose when they want to be in others. So yeah, the decolonization thing, I think it's tricky, because then also, of course, activists talk about the work that they're doing of decolonizing the museum. Is this something that the museum can do? Is it something that activists do in communities? I actually think that the work of decolonizing, I mean, it would be great if institutions were doing it, but I think it would come more from activists working along with community members and being able to roll out what those plans are, and then coming to institutions and kind of compelling some deep, real changes. But yeah, like I said, I would love to see museums stepping up to understanding what the full scholarship is of this, and then really engaging that.
Yeah, and I guess I'll kind of jump off of what you're saying, because I do think that there's a very decolonize this place / MTL and I know that Natasha and Amin, sorry, I just like blanked. Natasha and Amin were part of this conference earlier on, and you know, the Decolonize This Place and MTL have been very committed to this concept of decolonization in an intersectional way, and kind of trying to join in solidarity a variety of different you know, focuses. And I think that that's a very powerful place to kind of agitate from, and and one of the points that I wanted to make about that is especially related to Tanya's last point about like some of that work needing to come externally. You know, when you think about what happened at the Whitney around Warren Kanders finally leaving the board after you know, so many different protests, is that it happened it happened because of very many multiple layers. So you had the disclosure of his involvement in Safariland through an article in Hyperallergic written by Jasmine Weber very early on, a staff response that generated
Uh-oh. Laura froze on us. Maybe as we wait for her to unfreeze, this is, because Decolonize This Place talked about that. So they talked about the fact that the push to ask Warren Kanders to step down came from inside the institution. And that was a really interesting point for me, because they spoke about the ways in which they're responding to pressure from inside. So they're working from outside, putting pressure on the institution, but it's in response to what you know, the labor force in that institution is asking them to do. So I think that's in our jumpy conversation here, that takes me back to what you were saying, LaTanya, because you know, your point towards the hierarchy within the museums, and this kind of story of you saying like, oh, you know, some people have told you to wait until you're at a higher position and then you can really have influence. But what we're seeing actually now is the influence coming from below. We have the problems with museums are on two avenues right now, right? You have unions speaking up and unionization around safety and salaries. And then you have the pressure against funders, the pressure against war, big pharma, and, you know, and prison profiteering. That is actually funding these institutions. So really the biggest effect on change is coming from below and from outside, not from within, and definitely not from the top. So that's not really a question, is it? More of a statement. And I guess I'm the only one still, we're having some Zoom issue and LaTanya froze on me as well. Jill, are you there? Can you jump back on and see?
I am here. I am so sorry, guys. We're having this thing where Zoom has split our co-host, me and our director of the UCI Beall Center for Art and Technology. And so it seems as though half of us are here with me and then half of us are on his computer. However, it's the same Zoom webinar. So while we are familiar with Zoom, this is something we are not familiar with.
I thought it was the powers that be that knew we were talking about the real stuff over here, so they were stopping.
You know,
So are they all hearing
that
each
might
other?
be the case.
Are they all hearing each other?
You know, let me tell you, I'll reveal while we're here talking about Natasha and Amin, that, you know, we know the story about Zoom shutting down the Laila Khaled conversation, but Decolonize was not shut down. But I will reveal right now, whilst we're waiting, that we did have pressure. There was some pressure from student groups inside the institution to not, you know, there was some movement to not have the Decolonize This Place talk, and we fought it successfully. So that ended up happening. But I was worried there for a second. I was not worried about this one, because this is supposed to be the panel that appears to be benign and is not.
Right?
That's what I love about Decolonize. They don't want to appear to be benign. They're like, no, we're not benign.
Well, that's the point too, is that I think there has to be actions happening on multiple fronts in multiple ways. So I think this goes back to what you were saying and what Laura was saying, is that, and what I was saying earlier, what I like about the Museums Are Not Neutral initiative is encourages so many more people to realize they have their stakeholders here, right? And I always try to talk about museums in terms of like, let's get out of that dichotomy mindset of inside the institution versus outside. Let's think about these are porous spaces, and that, you know, we can reach arms through them like Swiss cheese, that we're going in and out of these spaces and working through them. And so some of us who are working on the inside at whatever position, whatever level, can be working for change. Anybody can really be a leader as long as they're educating themselves and, you know, growing and figuring out how to organize with others. And really, I actually think the most profound change will really be happening from the grassroots level, the people on the ground who do the work and who are communicating with communities. And then to really, I think a lot of the work is working with community members, working with activist groups that have already been out there doing the work for years. And sometimes for a lot of museum people, a lot of us don't know how to organize. It's not the training, especially if you were training to go to, you know, a museum education classes or whatever. Art history programs aren't, like I said, they're not training people to change the institution. And so many of us have gone into those spaces and then kind of gone, oh my gosh, this is a toxic environment, it's racist, it's sexist, it's all these things. And a lot of people keep their head down and just try to get through it. Some people get burned out and they leave and then they just try to do something else. So coming in and wanting to change it, it's like, it's important to look at people who have been doing work in the community all along and, you know, doing partnerships with them. Sometimes you can do it openly and you can make a t-shirt about it and wear it on across your chest and hashtags and all, or sometimes, you know, you leak stuff to people. And that's what some people have been doing in museums. And what we saw, definitely what was happening in Whitney probably, and other institutions or people working in institutions this summer, a lot of the activist work going on. There's so much more than what was written about. There was a lot that was written about, but there's so much more that didn't make it to the press. And there was people organizing and doing stuff. A lot of times the people in the institutions are very frightful, you know, who work in a museum are very afraid to publicly come out because, you know, they're trying to hold on to their jobs, and these are pretty retaliatory kind of spaces. So sometimes if there is another group out there that's doing this work, like Decolonize This Place or some other group, if it's possible to create an alliance with them, that can be great. That can also scare other staff members who are like, I don't want groups like that coming in here and pushing for change because they're afraid to lose their spot at the place, right? So it's a tricky place. And that's the stuff that, I mean, nobody was teaching me that about how these museum streets are some mean streets at times. And I didn't know that. It wasn't like I was completely naive. I have worked and stuff, but I didn't realize how deep it is. I feel like it's pretty entrenched, the racism in museums. It's pretty hardcore. And I have worked in a lot of other fields. And in museums, I'm just like, wow, like it is some deep stuff.
I'm wondering, so, you know, these things are hard, and we were talking about this with my students because we're talking about the institutions and we're talking about individuals. And when you're saying it's a very racist space, obviously it's not the building that's racist. And so where's that distinction between what is, like, you know, in the structure or you know, embedded in the language in a deeper way, and where is it that people enact it, and where can we intervene in between, you know, this kind of personal and structural?
Because, you know, some of it, of course, is just people's personalities and people who have certain ideas. So it is about individuals, interpersonal, but I mean, it is actually structural. So I started noticing that years ago, where I was kind of like, I don't know if I can stay in this field, because I don't think it's just these particular individuals who got whatever their personal, you know, racist issues are. But it was also because some of them, I didn't feel like were like that regularly, but when they would go in the building, they would behave differently because they felt like this is a culture that this is required. There's a lot of fear about changing anything in the institutions because they're like, well, donors will get upset. So I don't want to do programming or exhibitions that might disturb the status quo of racism that we already have in place at this institution. And they would tell me the things you want to do are too political. We have to keep it neutral. And I'm like, this is not neutral. This is a racist, this is a racist, elitist, very male-centered, ableist power structure that we're working in. And yet that's coded as normal. And so it becomes part of, like, you know, those expressions like best practices, these things that become sedimented in the institution and become just kind of like, so many people don't even see them anymore. They just become the neutral situation is this whiteness, this maleness, this elitism, this ableist kind of culture, very like, you know, gender violence is just like normalized in these spaces. And because people can come in as individuals and not believe those things individually, but feel like, and know it's real. Because I was often getting really angry at individuals and just being like really frustrated with them, but realizing their fear about change was there for a reason. It was, they had learned something having worked in this place for years, and they felt like, you know, don't rock the boat, go along with this. I don't like it either, but I'll do it. And I kept being like, but if more of us, you know, spoke up and spoke against that, we could make change happen. And they were looking at me like, you're crazy. You know, they don't want to risk their jobs. And some of them could be there, or they are white or white adjacent. They can pass. I'm not going to pass in these systems. I just, this is what I come in. This is the package I got. And I'm not geared to any type of, I didn't come into these institutions trying to change either. I didn't think, oh, I'm going to come in here and then I'm going to assimilate to this culture. That's never been my goal. And I think for some people, it wasn't really their goal, but they were maybe willing to do it. And I was never willing to do it. I have no desire to assimilate. I thought I can learn some things here, but I know I have a lot that these people don't know at all, like, because they have blinders on where they're not even seeing huge chunks of the world. And so I think it's sedimented into practices, stuff like who's donating art to these institutions. It was stuff like that at points where I would stand and watch and be like, oh my God, this is how white supremacy operates. This is the heteronormative male-centered institution at work. Because who has been like at Yale, who have been students at Yale for generations or hundreds of years, right? Who has been buying art, who has the ability to buy art, and then which artists do they buy? And then they donate those works to the institution. And so it just gets replicated over and over. And it was at one point where I was just standing watching one of these, like a donor come in, bring some art in, and I was standing there going, oh my God, this is it. This is it. And, you know, I know museum studies students, they keep teaching them the same things, like read about Harlem on my mind, which is very important to study. But there's so many other ways that racism is operating in institutions. It's all kinds of stuff. It's like fights for words, me fighting with the editorial department about words that I'm using where they won't ask me or they don't know. And they'll be like, there's no segregation anymore in the United States. I know, right? I was like, can I move to that United States? It sounds really good. Where is it? That is not my reality. And I'm like, I actually specialize in civil rights history and visual culture, but you don't think that I know what I'm talking about, and you don't invite me to be part of the conversation. So 3 white women who have no training in this have a meeting separately without me and decide that segregation doesn't exist anymore. So yeah, I mean, so it's happening. That's just like these little details, but it's things like that. And someone,
They're still on Zoom.
Editor telling me the words "and black" that was in a sentence. So she took out the words "black," and because she said she didn't understand it. And I was like, this is interesting, the rhetorical incoherence of blackness. So the whiteness is so thick that they cannot see it. You know, they don't question themselves. And so to take out the word, and I'm like, why is that hard? There's not a simpler way to say African American. I mean, you know, we can have a conversation about that. But it wasn't that. She was just like, I just don't understand what your show is about. And I'm like, it's about Black people. Put that back in the paragraph. It's just, and Black people. Like, put it back. And it was just, I don't understand. And then so I've, you know, using basically critical race theory and applying it to the museum to understand the museum, how race is so fundamental in it. And then I started to be able to pull it apart and go, oh my, that's how I started to go. It's not even as simple as the blood of the institution. It's what it is. Like, art museums are basically the bastions of white supremacy. And I think that's why we see that they fight really hard to stay the same, and they will, you know, shut down as many people as they can to keep it the same way. They will do all kinds of things to, like, you know, make those people's lives miserable and push them out. And so it's a hard space.
Thank you for that. I think Jill wants to jump in and say something?
You're just saying all these wonderful things, and I really don't want to interrupt anything. We have learned that we're going to have to, in order to continue and put everyone back into the same room, we're going to have to stop this webinar, which means it'll also stop our live stream. I'm going to go ahead and send everybody on YouTube through the chat a link to join the webinar along with the passcode so we can all reconvene as a unit. Thank you so much for continuing on the conversation. I've been back here behind the scenes freaking out and can't wait to listen to it later. So
right.
thank you, everybody. We're going to log out and then follow the same webinar link that got you into this original Zoom room. And everyone on YouTube, I will put that link into the chat. Okay? Sorry, guys.
But we should do that as speakers. We should go back to the one that we were given in the email.
Correct. We're going to leave this room and then follow that link again.
And come back. Okay, everybody leave and come back like a fire drill.